The Case of the Golden Guillotine, Inspector Purbright, BBC radio drama. The air in the marquee on the Chalmsbury Town Green carried a complex bouquet. It was a layered aroma, beginning with a base note of damp grass, adding a sharp, assertive middle note of prize-winning onions, and finishing with a top note of that particular English anxiety which accompanies any public judging of hobbies. It was the day of the annual Allotment Society show, an event of such deep-rooted importance that even the weather, a notoriously unreliable guest, had decided to behave. Presiding over the trestle tables, laden with impossibly large vegetables, was counsel. Chairman Harold Churm, Mr. Churm, was a man whose physical dimensions suggested a lifelong dedication to civic dinners. He believed that no occasion was too small for a speech, and no speech was complete without words like auspicious, legacy, and henceforth. And so, he boomed, his voice disturbing the delicate composure of a nearby tray of runner beans, "It is with immense personal pride that I, on behalf of the council, present a new perpetual trophy."
A trophy to symbolize the cutting edge of our town's horticultural prowess.
He gestured towards a small, velvet-draped object on a pedestal. With the flourish of a man unveiling a public convenience, he whipped the cloth away. A polite, slightly baffled murmur went through the crowd. The object that caught the afternoon light was a miniature guillotine. It stood about a foot high, fashioned from a metal of a yellow so aggressive it made gold seem bashful. The blade, poised dramatically, was silvered. Upon its wooden base, a brass plaque was inscribed, "The Golden Guillotine Award for Outstanding Achievement in Cultivation." Mr. Churm beamed. A witty modern design, a talking point.
To sever, as it were, the victor from the vanquished.
A silence of the sort usually reserved for a badly timed joke at a funeral settled over the marquee. Standing at the front, her arms folded into a single, formidable unit, was Mrs. Millicent Bunting. Mrs. Bunting had won the Best in Show award for the last 7 years. Her marrows were not merely grown, they were willed into existence through sheer force of personality. Her expression suggested she had just been informed that the laws of physics were now optional, and she did not approve. A few feet away, his back rigid with a lifetime of perceived injustices, stood Mr. Horace Nettleship. Mr. Nettleship was a man whose optimism had long since been composted. Every year his leeks were fractionally thinner, his tomatoes fractionally less spherical than Mrs. Bunting's. He stared at the garish trophy with an expression of profound loathing, as if it were personally responsible for the aphids on his broad beans. "Henceforth," Mr. Churm declared, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents, "this magnificent award will grace the mantelpiece of our annual champion." He paused for the applause, which, when it came, sounded like a light drizzle.
"And now I believe Mrs. Hoggett has the tea urn primed."
The mention of tea acted as a universal solvent, dissolving the social awkwardness. The small crowd shuffled dutifully towards the adjacent tent, a collective sigh of relief hanging in the air. Mrs. Bunting did not shuffle. She proceeded. Mr. Nettleship, after a final, venomous glare at the guillotine, sloped off in her wake. It was perhaps 10 minutes later, as Chairman Churm was debating the structural integrity of a fruit scone, that Mr. Alistair Finch, the Allotment Society's treasurer, scurried to his side. Mr. Finch was a man who looked permanently apologetic, as though he had been entrusted with the world's secrets and found them a terrible administrative burden. "Mr. Churm," he whispered, his voice a frantic buzz. "A word, if you please, Finch." "Good scone, isn't it?" Churm said heartily, a credit to Mrs. Hoggett's raising agents. "It's the trophy, Mr. Churm," Finch hissed, tugging at the chairman's sleeve.
The
guillotine. A triumph, I thought, eh?"
"Modern." "It's not that," Finch stammered, his eyes wide.
"It's just that it no longer is," Mr. Churm blinked.
"No longer is what, man?" "Speak plainly." "It's gone," whispered Mr. Finch. "The plinth is there."
"The velvet is there. but the trophy itself appears to have been misplaced. The two men hurried back into the main marquee. The prize vegetables sat in their silent, magnificent rows, oblivious. The pedestal, once the scene of Mr. Churm's oratorical triumph, was now a small stage of public failure. The velvet cloth lay pooled at its base, looking forlorn. Of the Golden Guillotine there was no sign at all. The cutting edge of horticulture had, it seemed, been blunted, or to be more precise, purloined. The telephone at the Chalmsbury police station rang with an insistent municipal urgency. Sergeant Sidney Love, a man whose worldview was as solid and rectangular as his own jaw, lifted the receiver. He listened for a moment, his expression shifting from dutiful boredom to mild disbelief. He held the receiver out towards the man sitting opposite him, who was calmly contemplating the slow, inexorable journey of a fly across the window pane. "It's for you, sir," Love said.
A theft.
"From the allotment show." Inspector Purbright turned his head, his gaze leaving the fly to its own devices.
A theft?
He inquired, his tone one of gentle curiosity. "Have Mrs. Bunting's prize-winning marrows been abducted?"
Not quite, sir, Love replied, a hint of a smile touching his lips. It's a trophy. A golden guillotine, they're calling it. Purbright blinked slowly. I see.
"I imagine the charge would be larceny rather than treason." He stood, smoothing the front of his jacket. "We should probably go and have a look, Sidney. A crime against horticulture is still a crime." When they arrived at the town green, the atmosphere in the marquee had curdled. The initial panic had settled into a state of affronted dignity, a mood far more challenging to police. Chairman Churm stood beside the empty pedestal like a captain on the bridge of a mysteriously stationary ship. His face was flushed with the sheer effrontery of it all. Mr. Finch, the treasurer, hovered at his elbow, wringing his hands as if trying to extract the last drops of moisture from them. "Inspector!" Churm boomed, relieved to have an official audience for his outrage.
An act of brazen vandalism. A slap in the face to the entire civic body.
"You saw nothing, I take it?" Purbright asked, his eyes calmly surveying the scene. "We were in the tea tent," Finch explained, his voice thin with apology. "The migration was general. There was a 10-minute window, no more." "Anyone could have slipped in." "And the object itself?" Purbright prompted. "A magnificent piece," Churm declared. "Solid gilt, I'm told. A substantial weight. Procured at no small expense to the Society's funds, I assure you." Purbright's gaze drifted over the remaining attendees, who were huddled in small, whispering clumps. Their attention was no longer on the oversized vegetables, but on the far more nourishing prospect of a local scandal. He saw Mrs. Bunting near the entrance, a cup of tea held steady in her hand, her expression one of supreme detachment, as if the whole affair were a minor plumbing issue in a neighbour's house. Of Mr. Horace Nettleship, however, there was no sign. Sergeant Love, his notebook already open, was making his own more direct inquiries. He approached a small group clustered around the parsnip display. "Wouldn't put it past him," a man in a tweed cap was muttering. "Never could stand seeing Millicent win. He gets a look on him, you know. Like curdled milk. It's the bitterness," a woman added, nodding sagely. "It gets into a man. Sours the soil." Love's pencil moved with renewed purpose. "This Mr. Nettleship," he said, turning to the group. "Was he here today?"
"Oh, he was here," the man in the cap confirmed. "Saw the trophy unveiled and looked like he'd swallowed a wasp. Slipped out just before the tea, now I come to think of it."
"Said he had to check his greenhouse for greenfly." Purbright, meanwhile, had bent down to examine the velvet cloth on the floor. It was undisturbed save for a single, small indentation where the base of the trophy had rested. He picked it up. There was nothing. He was not a man for fingerprints or fibres. He was a student of motive, and the motive currently being offered by the entire town seemed almost too perfect. He rejoined his sergeant. "It appears we have a popular suspect, Sidney." "Horace Nettleship," Love stated with satisfaction. "Sour grapes, plain and simple."
Motive, and from the sound of it, opportunity.
Disappeared right on cue. So it would seem, Purbright said, his eyes, once again, on the violated pedestal. The crime felt both trivial and deeply serious. It wasn't about the monetary value of a garish trophy. It was about the theft of order. In a town like Chalmsbury, that was a capital offence. Let's not rush to judgment, Sydney. A neat solution is often like a prize-winning carrot, very appealing on the surface, but liable to snap under pressure. The following morning, a gentle rain was giving Chalmsbury a thorough but respectful wash. In his office, Inspector Purbright looked out at the glistening slate roofs. Sergeant Love, meanwhile, was arranging a small stack of papers on his desk with military precision. "I've got Mr. Nettleship's address, sir," he announced, "and a list of his previous complaints to the Allotment Society Committee. It runs to 3 pages, mostly about the positioning of Mrs. Bunting's compost heap." "A rich vein of grievance, no doubt," Purbright murmured. "But I think we'll let Mr. Nettleship's conscience simmer for a while, Sydney. Let's begin instead with the victor. One should always pay one's respects to the Queen." Mrs. Millicent Bunting lived in a small, semi-detached house whose garden was a masterpiece of controlled growth. Not a weed dared show its head. She answered the door wearing an apron, a smudge of earth on her cheek, giving her the look of a warrior returned from a successful campaign. She led them not into a chintz-filled sitting room, but into a surgically clean kitchen that smelled faintly of soap and righteousness. "Inspector," she said, her voice as crisp as a freshly picked lettuce, "I suppose this is about that ridiculous contraption." "The trophy, yes," Purbright agreed, accepting a seat at a well-scrubbed pine table. "A regrettable business." "It's an inconvenience," Mrs. Bunting corrected him. "My entire schedule for winter bed preparation has been disrupted."
"I trust you won't take long." "We were wondering about Mr. Nettleship," Purbright said gently.
It's been suggested he was disappointed by the outcome of these competitions. Mrs. Bunting gave a short, sharp sigh. "Horace Nettleship has been disappointed since 1978. His soil is too acidic, but he won't listen to advice. Bitterness, Inspector, does terrible things to the pH balance."
"In soil and in men? Did you see him leave the marquee yesterday?" "I saw him scowl at that glittery monstrosity, and then I saw him leave."
I paid it no mind. Horace is always leaving in a huff about something. If I concern myself with his moods, I'd never get my seedlings potted. She looked Purbright directly in the eye. "He is a petty man, Inspector, but I doubt he is a thief. Theft requires a degree of ambition. Horace only has envy." Purbright considered this distinction. "You weren't fond of the trophy, then?" "It was a garish thing," she stated, as if passing final judgment. "Unsuitable."
"A simple silver cup is traditional. That guillotine
was a chairman's folly. Now, if you'll excuse me, my kale won't wait." Their interview concluded, Purbright left with the distinct impression that Mrs. Bunting would have been more animated by the theft of a bag of decent fertilizer. "Well," said Sergeant Love as they walked back towards the car, "she's a tough nut to crack." "She is a woman who understands fundamentals, Sydney," Purbright replied. "Soil, water and routine? She has no time for the decorative arts. Which brings me to the matter of finances." He paused. "Let's pay a call on the treasurer. Mr. Finch seemed a man burdened by more than just a missing trophy." They found Alistair Finch in his small house on Elm Street, in a room he called his study. It was less a room and more an archive of anxieties, with box files and ledgers stacked in teetering,
orderly columns. Mr. Finch himself looked as though he might at any moment be filed away by mistake. "Inspector, I didn't expect."
"Is there news?" "Just a few formalities," Purbright said, his presence seeming to take up most of the air in the cramped space. "We need to get the details of the stolen item for the official report."
"Its value, for instance." At the mention of the word value, a fresh wave of panic washed over Finch's face.
"Yes, of course, the value." He began patting his pockets as though the information might be hiding in one of them. "It was insured for £500, Chairman Churm insisted, as a significant asset of the society." "A round number," Purbright observed. Was that based on the purchase price? Mr. Finch swallowed.
More or less, approximately thereabouts. Could we see the receipt?
Sergeant Love asked, his pencil poised. The treasurer's composure finally crumbled. He sank into his chair, which squeaked in sympathy. This is the whole difficulty, you see.
It's most irregular, most unfortunate. What is, Mr. Finch?
Purbright asked softly. The paperwork, he whispered, defeated.
Mr. Grubb, the jeweller who procured it for us,
Well, he was rather informal about the invoice. It was more of a gentleman's agreement.
A figure was mentioned, the cheque was paid, but the official receipt, he said it would be forthcoming.
It has not as yet come forth. So you have no official proof of purchase for an item you insured for £500?
Purbright asked, his voice betraying no hint of judgment. It puts me in a terribly difficult position.
Finch wrung his hands. The auditors are due next month. Chairman Cherm was so proud of it, he simply waved my concerns away. He said the object's intrinsic value spoke for itself. And did it? Purbright asked. Mr. Finch looked up, his eyes pleading. To be perfectly honest, Inspector, he confessed in a small voice, I thought it looked rather brassy. Brassy, Sergeant Love repeated as they drove away from Elm Street. He gave the word a suspicious foreign sound.
It's a red herring, if you ask me, sir.
A treasurer trying to cover his own shoddy bookkeeping. The simple explanation is still the best one. Nettleship. You may be right, Sidney, Purbright said, his gaze fixed on the familiar Chalmsbury streets. Simplicity is always appealing. I think the time has come to put Mr. Nettleship's appeal to the test. Horace Nettleship's kingdom was his allotment, a plot of land behind a row of terraced houses. Unlike the companionable clutter of the other allotments, Nettleship's was a grid of severe militaristic order. His bean poles stood to attention, his rows of cabbages were aligned with geometric fury, and not a single tool was out of place. It was the garden of a man waging a private, bitter war against chaos. They found him in his greenhouse, a structure so clean its glass seemed to vanish in the damp air. He was meticulously tying up a tomato plant, his movements precise and jerky. He watched them approach in the reflection of the glass before turning, a thin, vinegary smile on his face. Inspector Purbright.
And Sergeant Love, to what do I owe the honour? Have you come to arrest my slugs?
I can assure you they have criminal intent. We're here about the trophy that went missing from the show yesterday. Mr. Nettleship, Love said, getting straight to the point. The Golden Guillotine, Nettleship said, snipping a leaf from the tomato plant with a vicious little flick of his secateurs.
A monument to bad taste. I heard it had been liberated.
I trust it will be melted down and used for something more useful. Plumbing, perhaps? We were told you left the marquee shortly after it was unveiled, Purbright said quietly. I did, Nettleship admitted without a shred of defensiveness. I couldn't stomach another moment of Harold Cherm's pompous droning, nor the sight of the committee fawning over St. Millicent of the miraculous marrow. My time is better spent here, encouraging actual growth. He gestured around the greenhouse. So you dislike the trophy? Love stated, his pencil making a decisive note. Disliked it?
Nettleship gave a dry chuckle. Sergeant, I considered it an insult to the very concept of horticulture.
It represented everything that's wrong with that society. It's not about skill anymore. It's about politics. It's about who provides the best sherry at the Christmas meeting. A man with such strong feelings might be moved to remove the offending object, Love suggested. Nettleship put down his secateurs and turned to face them fully, leaning against his potting bench. He seemed to be enjoying himself immensely. He might indeed.
Someone ought to have done it.
Someone ought to have dropped it into the Chalmsbury Canal.
A gesture, you understand.
For all the dedicated, overlooked growers who don't have the ear of the chairman. Are you saying you did that, sir? Love asked, his voice hardening. I'm saying it would have been a fine and noble act, Nettleship corrected him, a glint in his eye. But as for me, I came straight back here.
I had to fumigate for whitefly.
A task that, unlike the allotment society, produces tangible results. You are welcome to check my fumigators for fingerprints, though I doubt you'll find any. He smiled again. I always wear gloves when handling poison. Purbright, who had been observing the almost fanatical arrangement of pots on a nearby shelf, finally spoke. It must be very frustrating, Mr. Nettleship, to put in so much work for so little official reward. For the first time, Nettleship's theatrical bitterness wavered. He looked at the inspector, a flicker of genuine weariness in his eyes. You have no idea, he said, his voice dropping its sarcastic edge.
7 years I've tried to win Best League.
7 years, she beats me by 1/4 of an inch, and a smug little smile. You work the soil, you feed it, you protect it.
And for what? To be patronized! He caught himself and the cynical mask snapped back into place.
But I wouldn't want that tawdry bauble. It's the recognition I want. The acknowledgement of skill. As they left the allotment, Sergeant Love was practically buzzing with certainty.
That's our man, sir. No question.
He all but confessed. Hated the trophy, hated the winner, left at the right time, and he's clearly enjoying the notoriety. He's playing games with us. Purbright opened the car door, pausing before he got in. He's certainly playing a game, Sydney, he agreed. But it feels less like the game of a thief, and more like that of a man who has finally been given the stage he has always craved. One wonders if he'd be quite so talkative if he had something to hide. Back in the quiet confines of his office, Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, a cup of tea cooling beside him. Opposite, Sergeant Love was typing his report with a series of decisive, satisfied clicks. Each tap of the keys seemed to drive another nail into the coffin of Horace Nettleship's innocence. The case, from Love's perspective, was tidy. It had a beginning, a middle, and an obvious, sour-faced end. Purbright, however, was not looking at the report. He was studying his own notebook, which contained only a few spidery lines of his own handwriting. He read them over and over, not as a collection of facts, but as a series of tones and impressions. Mrs. Bunting, inconvenience, not loss. Nettleship, performance, not confession. The man's theatrical bitterness was a distraction, a loud noise designed to draw attention. Purbright's experience had taught him that the truth rarely shouted. It whispered, often from the wings. His eyes settled on the third entry. Finch, value, receipt, brassy. And there was another detail, a fragment of conversation he hadn't bothered to write down at the time. When Purbright had pressed him about the trophy's condition, Finch had said something odd. Chairman Churm was very particular. He had it brought over from the jeweller's the morning of the show, just after it had received a special cleaning for a brand new object. It was a trivial remark, the sort of detail that gets smoothed over in a formal report. Yet it snagged in Purbright's mind. One polishes something old to make it look new. Why polish something new unless one feared it might soon look old? He stood up. The sudden movement made Sergeant Love pause his typing mid-clatter. Sydney, Purbright said, I think we need to go back to the town green. Love looked baffled.
To the marquee, sir?
They'll be taking it down soon. Besides, we've got all we need from there. Perhaps, Purbright said, already reaching for his coat. But I'd like to look at the stage again, now that the actors have gone home. The marquee was a changed place. The proud ranks of vegetables had been claimed by their owners, leaving only the earthy scent and a few stray cabbage leaves behind. 2 workmen were beginning to untie the ropes at the far end. The pedestal, the scene of the crime, stood alone in the centre of the cavernous space, looking diminished and slightly absurd. Purbright walked directly to it. He ignored the pedestal itself and crouched down, examining the small trestle table it stood upon. He ran a gentle finger across the tabletop, a surface scarred by years of service to tea-urns and raffle prizes. His finger stopped. There was a small, fresh scratch in the wood, a short, curved line right beside where the velvet cloth had been, as if a heavy object with a sharp edge had been twisted slightly before being lifted. Then he turned his attention to the square of dark blue velvet, which had been left on the table as part of the scene. He picked it up. It was just a cheap piece of display fabric. He brought it closer, expecting the marquee's general aroma of damp canvas and soil. Instead, his senses registered something else. It was faint, almost entirely faded, but it was unmistakably there. It was a sharp, clean citrus scent. It was not the organic smell of a lemon from a tree. It was the precise, manufactured fragrance of household furniture polish. Sergeant Love had come to stand beside him. "Find something, sir?" Purbright looked at the velvet cloth, then at the empty space where the trophy had been. He thought of Horace Nettleship's earthy, chaotic greenhouse, a place of soil and sweat and righteous indignation. This scent did not belong to that world. It belonged to parlours and sideboards, to dusters and routine, to the quiet, indoor work of maintaining appearances. He carefully folded the cloth and slipped it into an evidence bag from his pocket. A hint of domesticity. "Sydney," Purbright said, his voice thoughtful. "It seems a very civilized perfume for such a passionate crime." In the car on the way back to the station, Sergeant Love held the evidence bag containing the velvet cloth as if it might contain an explosive device.
"Lemon polish, sir?"
"What does that tell us?" "It suggests the crime was not committed in a fit of agricultural rage," Purbright said thoughtfully. "It suggests a certain neatness, a concern for appearances."
"And there are two main reasons people are concerned with appearances, Sydney."
"The first is moral standing, the second is financial credit. I think we ought to investigate both." He tapped a finger on the dashboard. "Let's begin with the town's moral compass. I believe the Reverend Littlewood had some rather strong opinions on our Golden Guillotine. The vicarage of St. Michael in the Fens was a place of quiet, scholarly untidiness. Books were not so much shelved as settled, creating sedimentary layers on every available surface. The Reverend Ambrose Littlewood himself, a mild, bespectacled man with a kindly, distracted air, greeted them with a gentle handshake that felt as dry as old parchment. "Inspector, do come in. I was just wrestling with a particularly stubborn piece of Aramaic."
"A cup of tea?"
As they sat in armchairs that had offered comfort to generations of troubled parishioners, Purbright guided the conversation towards the allotment show. "We're exploring all avenues regarding the stolen trophy," he began. "I understand you weren't an admirer of the design." The Reverend gave a small, apologetic smile.
"An admirer?"
"No, Inspector, I was not."
"I did mention my concerns to Harold Cherm, in the politest possible way, of course."
To celebrate the gentle art of cultivation with an instrument of summary execution struck me as incongruous. It was gaudy, it was unseemly, and frankly, it was in appalling taste. He peered at Purbright over his spectacles. One tries to encourage the civic virtues, pride in one's work, healthy competition. But that object seemed to glorify something else entirely, a rather vulgar triumphalism. "Strong words, Vicar," Sergeant Love observed, his pen scratching in his notebook. "Am I a suspect, then?" the Reverend asked, with a flicker of academic curiosity. "The avenging cleric spiriting away the graven image?" "I assure you, Inspector, my methods of protest are confined to the parish newsletter. And while I am glad the thing is gone, I would not have been the agent of its removal. My conscience is clear, though my aesthetic sensibilities are still in recovery." His alibi, a meeting with the diocesan treasurer in Chalmsbury, was as solid and unexciting as the vicarage foundations. Purbright left with the impression of a man who would sooner die than commit a social faux pas, let alone a crime. Yet his words lingered. Appalling taste.
Vulgar triumphalism.
The vicar had objected to the trophy's appearance. Mr. Finch, the treasurer, had worried about its substance. It was time, Purbright decided, to visit the source of both. Mr. Sidney Grubb, retired jeweller and silversmith, operated from the front parlour of his small terraced house, a room that still bore the faint metallic scent of his former trade. He was a small, bird-like man with magnified eyes that darted behind thick spectacles. He greeted the policeman with a nervous affability, polishing a silver locket with a cloth as he spoke. "Inspector Purbright."
An honour, a terrible business this. A piece of my own procuring, you know.
A tragedy? That's what we wanted to ask you about, Mr. Grubb, Purbright said, his tone casual. To get the details for our report. It was a valuable piece, I'm told. Valuable?
Oh, absolutely, Grubb said quickly, a little too quickly.
A fine example of modern decorative art, a bespoke commission. What was it made of precisely? Purbright inquired. The base metal. Mr. Grubb's polishing momentarily ceased. The base metal? Well, that would be a high-density composite alloy. For strength, you see. You can't have a trophy of that size made of soft metal. Wouldn't be durable. And the gold finish?
Ah, Grubb said, warming to the topic.
That was a specialized, multi-layered electro-gilding process, not your common or garden plating. This was a proprietary finish, designed for maximum luster and longevity.
Very advanced, very yellow. So it wasn't solid gilt?
Sergeant Love asked bluntly. The jeweller looked offended.
Solid gilt? At that price?
The Allotment Society's budget is not unlimited, Sergeant. This was a fine balance of impressive aesthetics and fiscal responsibility. Chairman Sherm was adamant on that point. He wanted maximum visual impact for a sensible outlay. Purbright leaned forward slightly. Mr. Finch, the treasurer, seemed to recall some issue with the receipt. Grubb's hands, which had been so steady, began to fidget with the locket. Alistair Finch is a born worrier. The paperwork is all perfectly in order, merely delayed. The supplier I used is a small artisanal workshop. They are geniuses, but not, shall we say, masters of administration. The invoice is being processed. He avoided Purbright's gaze, looking instead at a display of tarnished spoons in a cabinet behind the inspector's head. He was a man who suddenly seemed far more comfortable with the past than the immediate present. Leaving the house, Sergeant Love shook his head. Well, sir, that's another one for the list. He's as nervous as Finch is. What do you make of all that talk of composite alloys and proprietary finishes?
I make of it, Purbright said, looking back at the small, unassuming house, that Mr. Grubb has an excellent vocabulary.
It is a very useful tool for a man who does not wish to say the word brass. The following morning brought with it a sense of administrative unease. At the police station, Sergeant Love was attempting to construct a coherent timeline, a task complicated by the fact that his list of suspects now included a malcontent gardener, a prevaricating jeweller, and the spiritual guide of the entire parish. The case, which had begun with the simple, satisfying logic of sour grapes, was becoming unpleasantly convoluted. Inspector Purbright, by contrast, seemed untroubled by the expanding cast. He was quietly reading a council report on footpath maintenance, an activity he found cleared the head wonderfully. He believed that the solution to a puzzle was rarely found by staring at it, but by allowing it to arrange itself while one's mind was occupied with more mundane matters. The matter of the Golden Guillotine, he suspected, was not about who had a reason to steal it, but who had the most compelling reason for it to cease to exist. He was halfway through a spirited debate on the subject of loose paving stones when the telephone rang. It was the town clerk, his voice a tight knot of official distress. "Inspector? You must come at once. There has been a development." The town clerk's office was a shrine to organized bureaucracy. When Purbright and Love were shown in, they found the clerk, a Mr. Dalloway, standing beside his desk as if it were the scene of an explosion. On the pristine blotter lay a single, cream-coloured envelope. Chairman Harold Sherm was also present, his arms folded, his expression that of a man whose patience was being tested by a universe of fools. "It arrived with the morning post," Mr. Dalloway said, pointing a trembling finger at the envelope, "addressed to the Chalmsbury Council Committee for Public Decency, an entity which I assure you does not exist." Purbright picked up the envelope. It was made of thick, expensive paper, the sort of stationery that implied a certain social standing. Inside was a single matching sheet folded once. The message was written in neat, slightly slanted block capitals. It read, Let it be known that the idolatrous object, that garish monument to vanity which you saw fit to inflict upon this town, has been removed from public view. It has been taken and it has been cleansed. It will not be returned. Let this be a lesson in humility to those who prize glitter above godliness. There was no signature. Chairman Churm let out a snort of indignant fury.
A crank!
A religious fanatic.
This is what it comes to, Inspector.
A council does its best to raise the tone of a civic event, and we are met with this puritanical vandalism. It certainly has a moralizing tone, Purbright agreed calmly. He held the letter closer, his gaze neutral. The scent was very faint, almost lost beneath the aroma of paper and ink, but it was there. A clean, sharp ghost of lemon, moralizing. Churm boomed.
It's a confession. It's as good as signed by the vicar himself.
You told me he'd voiced his objections, Inspector.
He called it unchristian, did he not?
Well, here is his sermon in writing. Purbright laid the note back on the desk. It was, he thought, a most helpful piece of correspondence. It provided a motive, a confirmation of the crime, and a clear direction for the investigation. It wrapped the whole untidy business up and pointed a firm, self-righteous finger towards the doors of the church. It was, in fact, a little too helpful. A true zealot, Purbright mused, might be driven to theft, but would he be so considerate as to send a communiqué that clarified his motives so neatly?
It felt less like an act of righteous anger and more like a carefully drafted press release. We will, of course, look into it, Mr. Churm, he said.
He placed the note and envelope into an evidence bag. As they walked down the steps of the town hall, Sergeant Love was visibly relieved. The case had snapped back into focus. Well, that settles it, sir. It has to be the Reverend Littlewood. The motive, the language.
It all fits.
And now this, he tapped the evidence bag. It seems he wasn't as passive as he made out. It does seem to point rather emphatically in his direction, Purbright conceded, his eyes on the grey Chalmsbury sky. So, we go and have another chat with him. A more formal one this time. Not just yet, Sidney, Purbright said. A man who takes the trouble to write a letter like that is a man who wants to be noticed. I think for the time being we shall decline his invitation. The telephone on Inspector Purbright's desk rang at precisely 9 o'clock the next morning. It was, as he had expected, Chairman Churm. His voice, stripped of its usual booming confidence, was a strained, reedy thing. He requested a discreet private word at the town hall to discuss a matter of some delicacy. Of course, Mr. Churm, Purbright replied smoothly. I think it would also be helpful if Mr. Finch and Mr. Grubb could be present, to ensure we have all the relevant facts at our disposal. There was a choked sound at the other end of the line, followed by a mumbled acquiescence. Chairman Churm's office was a room dedicated to the performance of importance. A vast mahogany desk stood before a tall leather chair, and the walls were lined with books that looked as though they had been bought by the yard for the richness of their bindings. When Purbright and Sergeant Love were shown in, the three men were already there, arranged in a miserable tableau of civic disgrace. Churm stood stiffly by the window. Finch was perched on the edge of a chair, twisting a handkerchief, and Grubb seemed to be trying to shrink into the floral pattern of the carpet. "Good morning, gentlemen," Purbright said, his voice calm and conversational. He placed his hat on the corner of the desk.
I have good news.
I have just telephoned the county museum. There will be no need for Dr. Fleming, the expert, to make the journey to Chalmsbury after all. I believe we can resolve this entire unfortunate business right here. 3 pairs of shoulders slumped in unison, the collective release of unbearable tension. The game was over, and they knew it. Purbright did not sit down. He walked slowly over to the window, looking out onto the town square for a moment before turning back to face them. Let us suppose, he began, his tone less that of an accuser and more of a historian reconstructing a sequence of events. Let us suppose that the problem was never the theft of the Golden Guillotine, but the Golden Guillotine itself. Let us suppose it was not stolen for its great value,
but for its profound lack of it, he looked at Sidney Grubb, a respected craftsman.
Asked to produce a trophy of maximum visual impact for a sensible outlay. A difficult brief, Mr. Grubb, one that might tempt a man to use modern, cost-effective materials. A composite alloy, perhaps, with a finish that, while visually striking, might not be as durable as one would hope. A finish that might, under close inspection, reveal itself to be little more than a thin wash over common brass. Grubb stared at his shoes, his silence a complete confession. Purbright's gaze moved to the treasurer. And let us suppose a meticulous man like yourself, Mr. Finch, is presented with the bill. A substantial sum, but with no formal, itemized invoice.
A gentleman's agreement. It would place you in a dreadful position.
Too timid to question the chairman, too conscientious to be comfortable. You would be a man caught in a nightmare of improper accounting. Finch's twisting of the handkerchief became frantic. A small, miserable nod was his only reply. Finally, Purbright looked at the chairman. And pride, Mr. Cherm, the pride of a man who has presented his town with a grand modern symbol of success. What would happen to that pride if the symbol were to be exposed as a sham? If the gilt began to fade, the brass began to show? Public humiliation is a terrible thing to contemplate. Cherm drew himself up, a final, futile effort at indignation. This is outrageous speculation, Inspector.
Is it? Purbright asked softly.
I imagine the object didn't look quite right on the morning of the show.
I imagine it needed a little help.
A frantic, last-minute buffing to make it shine under the lights. You might use a household furniture polish for such a task. Something with a lemon scent, perhaps. It would leave a faint but distinctive aroma on the velvet cloth it rested on. The chairman's face, which had been puce, now paled to a mottled grey. And then, the moment of unveiling arrives, Purbright continued, his voice relentless in its quiet logic. And you realize that the polish hasn't worked.
That the trophy looks cheap.
What can be done? To withdraw it is to admit failure. But for it to be stolen that casts you as the victims, a 10-minute window during the tea interval is all that's required. One of you slips back into the marquee and simply removes it. And the note? Sergeant Love prompted, playing his part. Ah, the note, Purbright said.
A masterstroke of misdirection.
Who would suspect you, the dignified victims, when a fanatical crank has claimed responsibility? It deflects all suspicion onto the Reverend Littlewood.
And the note contains a clever little joke, does it not?
It has been cleansed. A moral cleansing for the public. But also a reference, I suspect, to the literal polishing the object had just received before it was hidden away. He let the silence hang in the room. It was Finch who broke it, his voice a barely audible whisper. The archives, in the old deed box for the town market. We didn't know what else to do. Cherm sank into his large leather chair, a deflated monument to his own vanity.
It was the only way, he muttered.
To avoid a scandal. To protect the society's reputation. To protect your own reputations, you mean? Purbright said, his voice for the first time carrying a sliver of ice. He did not, however, press the point. Justice in this case was not a matter for the courts. The item, then, has been misplaced, not stolen. A regrettable administrative error. I trust you will find it, Mr. Finch, and report the good news. He picked up his hat. I imagine the trophy will be found to be damaged beyond repair during the incident. My official report will state the case is closed due to the recovery of the lost property. He paused at the door. Reputation, gentlemen, he said, to the three defeated figures, is like a gilded trophy. It is a fragile thing, and it requires a great deal of polishing to maintain. But it is always best if there is something of substance underneath. Back in his office, Sergeant Love closed his notebook with a definitive snap. He looked at the inspector, who was once again watching a fly navigate the complex geography of the window pane. The neat conclusion of a signed confession and a charge sheet had been denied him, leaving a slightly untidy feeling in its place. "So that's it then, sir?" he asked. "No charges? No official action?" "The matter has been resolved, Sidney," Purbright said, turning from the window. "Mr. Cherm's pride has been dented, Mr. Finch's books will now balance, and Mr. Grubb has received a valuable lesson in metallurgy. In a small town, the restoration of equilibrium is sometimes a more effective form of justice than a court summons, and so equilibrium was restored. A short article appeared in the Chalmsbury Chronicle the following week. It announced that the now famous Golden Guillotine had been located, but had, regrettably, sustained damage beyond repair during its period of misplacement. The Allotment Society Committee, in a statement from the chairman, announced that a return to tradition was in order and a modest, elegant silver cup had been commissioned as a replacement. At a brief, hastily arranged ceremony devoid of any lengthy speeches, the new cup was presented to Mrs. Millicent Bunting. She accepted it with a curt nod, her expression indicating that it was no more or less than she expected. Later that week in the Mason's Arms, Horace Nettleship was heard complaining loudly to anyone who would listen. His grievance, however, had moved on. The topic was no longer the bias of the judges, but the demonstrably inferior quality of the peat-free compost supplied by the council that year, a clear conspiracy to sabotage the independent grower. At the police station, Inspector Purbright typed a brief final report. It stated that the item, initially reported as stolen, had been located by the owners and that the matter was now closed. He took his own sparse handwritten notes, filled with phrases like scent of polish and fear of experts, and clipped them to the official sheet. He did not walk to the cabinet marked Criminal Investigations. Instead, he went to a tall, dusty filing cabinet in the corner of the room, one used for the odds and ends of civic life. He opened a drawer labelled LM. He slid the entire file for the case of the Golden Guillotine into a folder that sat between Lost Pets and Miscellaneous Complaints. The file was titled simply Lost Property. He returned to his desk, sat down, and picked up the report on footpath maintenance he had been reading 2 days before. His finger found his place. The quiet, important work of Chalmsbury went on. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.